The original Dragon Quest was released in Japan for the Famicom on May 27, 1986, where it was initially met with low sales and, seemingly, failure. But word of mouth and articles from its creator, Yuji Horii, in Weekly Shonen Jump, created enough buzz that the game eventually became a massive success. It's something I covered extensively when I previously looked at this initial game that would spawn one of the most important RPG franchises in gaming history. But that first follow-up is always difficult. Follow the formula too closely and players will feel like they've already seen it all. Change it too much and those same players might feel alienated. It's something many landmark series struggle with on the NES. And yet, Horii and his team managed to strike that balance, creating a game that not only sold better than the original, but set the stage for the series' future success. So why isn't Dragon Quest II as fondly remembered anymore? Well, it all comes down to time versus ambition. To say that Dragon Quest II's development was tight is an understatement. Planning for the sequel began in April of 1986, a month before the first game was even released, with the estimated release date being late December of that year. It was an incredibly hectic schedule to be sure, but Horii's team seemed prepared. After all, the original Dragon Quest was designed to be an introduction to RPGs for console gamers. It's why everything was kept so simple, and why there was only ever one party member, the hero. Combat was limited to one-on-one fights, which the team knew would become inherently monotonous. But they felt this was worth the trade-off, as it kept everything else simple as well, such as managing equipment since the hero could wield anything. Dragon Quest II was intended to be the next step, with the core idea being that the game would feature a full party. Naturally, the team knew this intention contained inherent risk. As Horii himself wrote in a later essay in the Famicom Tsushin magazine, PC players might be used to managing different characters, each with their own unique equipment and skills, but those who only played on the Famicom might become frustrated by the hassle, especially children. However, the team pushed forward with the idea despite this concern, because there would be more strategies, more possibilities, more ways for those fascinated by RPGs to discover what makes them fun. And having just played Dragon Quest II for the first time, specifically the US release on NES, they absolutely succeeded. From the outset, the game feels better. Command prompts are simplified so that using the stairs no longer has to be selected, stat changes from equipping new items are immediately shown, and more monsters can be fought at once. It creates a fantastic first impression, especially after coming from the first game. There are compromises, of course, with the battle screen seeing the biggest change. No longer is the monster displayed on the field, reflecting where you're fighting. Instead, every battle is in a black void where all the monsters appear next to one another. It's a shame to lose that sense of place, but it's something I found myself adjusting to rather quickly. Incredibly, Yuji Horii was remarkably forthright in what it took to develop Dragon Quest II, breaking down every step of the process in his Famicom Tsushin article. It's a fascinating look, and it all started with the team determining a memory map, or how the available memory within the Famicom would be divided in order to accommodate their ideas. For example, the team wanted to display everything as much as possible, as console players were used to visual feedback. In PC RPGs, one character might represent a party of 5, or a single monster could be a group of 3. It was rare at the time for every element of the battle to be shown on screen. The team at Chunsoft put a major focus on actually displaying the entire party whenever they were walking around, and having each individual monster be shown during battle. In order to determine the ideal party size, they looked at the available sprite limits in memory, determining that 3 was perfect as it would prevent flickering and players could feasibly talk to a single NPC without issue. The article also reflects on how the memory map was necessary for the RPG system itself. After all, this determined how they would calculate experience values, the amount of gold earned, equipment and level stats, magic power, and so on. It would even affect the process of reviving fallen party members, as bringing back 2 at once would take too long, so it had to be done one at a time. Really, it was thanks to the programming knowledge of Koichi Nakamura, founder of Chunsoft and returning director, that the team was able to keep everything to a manageable scale. But keeping it manageable also meant meetings were necessary in order to properly allot the available space. The team was split into 2 groups, with one focusing on the story and monster design, while the second handled the programming itself. The story group would lay out how many monsters and how much dialogue they wanted, while the programmers would detail how they wanted the systems to work and how much programming was needed to achieve certain ideas. It was such a constant push and pull that Horii even likened the process to a government budget meeting. Once all this planning was complete by July, Horii began focusing on what the story of Dragon Quest II would be, as well as designing the world itself. The game would be a direct sequel to the original, picking up 100 years later and focusing on the descendants of that game's hero, who each came to rule their own kingdom out in the wider world. However, a new threat has arisen, Hargon, and he has launched a campaign to conquer the land, starting with Moonbrook. While the king is lost, his daughter manages to survive while a lone soldier struggles to reach the kingdom of Midenhall. Learning of the threat Hargon poses, Midenhall's prince sets out to unite with his cousins, the Princess of Moonbrook and the Prince of Cannock, and discover a way to stop this new evil. Structurally, the story works in much the same way as the first. The Prince of Midenhall is silent at all times, while his cousins only have a few lines of dialogue. They must travel from town to town gathering information and learning about what they need in order to even reach Hargon. But, at least in the beginning, the game takes the opportunity to inject some personality into them. For example, the first quest the player undertakes is to meet up with the Prince of Cannock, so you travel to the kingdom only to learn that he's set out on his own quest. The townspeople speak of a place to the east called the Spring of Bravery, so the hero travels there and reaches the end of the cave. Only the old man there tells you that the prince has already left for Midenhall, so you return to Midenhall only to find out that he just left. With nowhere left to search, the hero goes to the village of Leftwine, where he's sleeping at the inn. And it's there that the two join up. It's not much, but it does convey that he's ready to set out on his own adventure, even if he may be a bit bumbling. There's even artwork that kinda conveys this. Of course, after this, he is a stoic and silent companion until the very end. Likewise, the princess has a quest that must be done before she can join. When the hero and the Prince of Cannock arrive in Hamlin, they discover a mysterious dog that will follow them if talked to, though it never leaves the town. Word spreads of ways to break a spell, and it becomes evident that the dog is actually the transformed Princess of Moonbrook. It doesn't add to her character, but completing a quest in order to obtain the third party member does make her more memorable. But what I personally loved was the shift in tone once the party was complete. Until this point, the overworld music was exactly the same as the original Dragon Quest. Moody, dreary, the feeling that the weight of the world was against you. But as soon as the princess joins, the music shifts into something more hopeful, exciting, and triumphant. The tone doesn't always work, especially when I reach the final section of the overworld, but the idea that this is a party of friends confronting a great evil rather than a lone hero is absolutely emphasized. In fact, I believe Dragon Quest II has an even better soundtrack than the original. Composed once again by Koichi Sugiyama, the music is much richer and more diverse this time around, while keeping many of the iconic tracks. I mean, the main overture is never going anywhere. But compare the battle theme of the original to the battle theme of 2. The sequel feels more like an epic fight, while the original feels more droning upon reflection. It fits the mood of that game, but the new songs feel more modern in execution. In fact, Dragon Quest II is the origin of many of the jingles still used in the recent games, such as a party member joining, and reviving a fallen ally. Sugiyama even expands upon some of the jingles. Whereas being defeated in battle would be emphasized in a short jingle before, here it is a continuous song lamenting the failure of the party. Even better, the game doesn't fill up its soundtrack with 8 variations of its cave theme, and instead diversifies with themes for the towers, towns, castles, and more. Overall, it's the superior soundtrack. And the music wasn't the only element to become more ambitious. The monsters were expanded as well. Brought to life once again by Akira Toriyama, the process of creating the creatures the party would fight was done in much the same way as the original. The story team would think up the monsters along with their names and skills before Toriyama fleshed out their look. But seeing as Toriyama had no familiarity with converting his artwork into computer graphics, this would be done by staff members on the programming team. Toriyama found himself still enjoying the experience as it allowed him to paint rather than simply draw manga pages. Once again, the sheer amount of monsters that was included in the sequel compared to the original is impressive, doubling the amount from 40 to 82. Now granted, some of these are returning monsters and reskins, though not as many as you'd think. Of course, the slime returned, but not the she slime, or red slime as it was originally translated. Instead, Dragon Quest II introduced heal slimes, originally known as healers, bubble slimes, which have the amazing name of Babbles on NES, and liquid metal slimes, or metal babbles. Otherwise, only the Draki returned with the new Drakmage or Magidraki variant, and the Green Dragon, though not the red or blue ones. Where it becomes truly impressive is when you count the amount of monster types. The original had 13 unique monsters, not counting their variants or the final boss. In comparison, Dragon Quest II had 35 unique monsters, again not including its final boss. That is a massive jump in only a short amount of time. And like the original, many of these would return in later games. After all, this is the introduction of sorcerers, zombies, mummies, mannequins, and the always upper echelon of gigantes and archdemons. The amount of designs Toriyama created in such a short time is simply amazing. But of all the monsters, it's perhaps the orc that had the largest impact on Japanese culture. Before Dragon Quest II, orcs tended to look as they still do in the West, heavily influenced by The Lord of the Rings and Dungeons & Dragons with green skin and a beast-like appearance. But after Toriyama introduced his version of an orc in this game, suddenly orc design started to change in Japan. It's why so many RPGs and anime feature orcs that have a pig-like appearance. It can be presumed that this is why moblins in The Legend of Zelda went from dog-like in design to pig-like. Even a game as recent as Final Fantasy XVI features boar-like elements on their orcs. In the same way that Toriyama redefined what a slime should look like for the series, so too did he do the same for orcs in general. It's a testament not only to the appeal of Dragon Quest, but of Toriyama himself, a true legend of the industry. But it wasn't just Toriyama that put in an incredible amount of work. What the team at Chunsoft pulled off in such a short time should not be underestimated. So let's talk about this new quest. Whereas before I went step by step over the journey that was the original Dragon Quest, I feel that's less necessary here as it mostly follows the general outline of that game, especially in its opening hours. Players are given the option to name their hero, the Prince of Meadenhall, and as I suck at naming characters, I looked up to see if there were any official names. It turns out there was a novelization that gave him the name Alan, so I went with that. Unlike the original, the name of your character does not affect their stats. Instead, it somehow determines what the names of the Prince of Cannock and the Princess of Moonbrook will be out of a list of 8 names each. In my case, that would be Lars and Alyssa, which is how I'll be referring to them from now on. One of the first things I realized upon playing Dragon Quest II was just how much it improved on the original. Yes, grinding is still absolutely necessary, and you can expect most of your playtime to involve doing just that. But there are other quality of life improvements overall. I already mentioned not having to select stairs in order to use them, but then there's the save system. Before, players could only save at the castle, which served as a base of operations, and much of the world would be explored branching out from that point. But due to the size of this sequel, that would be massively inconvenient. Fortunately, it's possible to save not only at Meadenhall and Cannock, but once players make it to the next continent, at certain towns too. These smaller bases spread across the map are a lifesaver and make reaching the next destination feel all the safer, as long as they actually have a way to save. And later towns not having that could feel extremely deflating. After all, having every party member die means your money is cut in half and things aren't exactly cheap in this world. The other big change is to caves and dungeons. Where Dragon Quest I required torches or a light spell to see in the dark, the sequel illuminates every cave so that it isn't necessary. Instead, certain sections are blanked out until the player enters them. It's not exactly ideal, as many of these lead to dead ends later on and draw out the dungeon, but it not only saves on resources, but makes exploring the caves way more interesting. At least early on, but I'll get to that eventually. Strangely, resources are both improved upon and made more of a hassle. For one, with 3 party members, each one can carry 8 items, which allows players to better have what they need. There's even the smart change that keys to open doors are no longer a usable resource. Instead, there are 3 types of doors, and as long as you have the specific key for that door, you can always enter. However, this leads to a problem in the late game. Those 3 keys have to remain in your inventory as they are necessary until the final dungeon. There is a spell to open doors later, but I was stingy with my MP as there's no way to recover it outside of resting. Then there are the various key items, many of which are needed for that last section as well. Add in the 3 pieces of equipment and an accessory that each character will likely have at this point, and suddenly all that extra inventory space is nearly gone. Without proper management, it's easy to not have enough room for an important item. Fortunately, it never reached that point for me by the end. No, the problem was when it came to equipment. While Dragon Quest II shows how stats will improve when equipping new armor and weapons, it never relays who can use that equipment. Instead, it became a game of trial and error where I had to trade what I bought between the party to see if I should save for another one. And if the inventory is getting full, then it becomes even more of a hassle. It got to the point that I simply looked up who could equip what just to save myself some time. This is more of an issue of time than anything else, but it's a hint of how there are a few cracks beneath the surface that will add up. In any case, the equipment is but one way that the game shows how different the characters are from one another. Unlike the hero of Dragon Quest I, the royal cousins are not prepared for every threat on their own. They need each other in order to function. Alan, despite being the hero, has no access to magic. He can equip the best weapons and get access to Erdrick's legendary armor set, but without items, he cannot heal himself. However, he hits the hardest out of all the characters and is absolutely vital in defeating monsters quickly. Lars, the Prince of Cannock, is a jack of all trades, able to equip some armor and decent weapons, but also has access to magic. In many ways, he emulates the abilities of the original hero, able to cast outside to escape dungeons, return to fast travel to the last save point, and the new step guard to protect from dangerous floors. Early on, he's also your healer, and while he's eventually outclassed, he's the only one that can revive fallen party members. Finally, the Princess of Moonbrook, Alyssa, is completely magic-focused. She not only has access to the best healing and attacking spells, but also repel to keep low-level enemies away. It should be said that there are quite a few new spells as well to accommodate the increase in enemies. These monsters can be lined up individually or placed in groups, which is a vital distinction. The spell Infernos, for example, is able to hit a group of enemies, spreading out the damage far more than what Alan is capable of, and potentially defeating them faster. However, the spell doesn't damage every enemy on screen, only those within the targeted group, and if that group or an enemy is defeated before the spell activates, then the MP will still be used and the move wasted. Like many RPGs, the party will not switch to available enemies if it's defeated before their turn, but the groups mitigate that issue and make it simple to ensure every attack hits. Plus, there's the other group spell, Explodette, which does hit every monster on the screen, though it costs a lot of MP. While there are even more powerful spells that become available at later levels, I tended not to use them as they were either chance-heavy or far from worth it. Lars learns Defeat, which can instantly kill a group of enemies, though it's horribly inaccurate. Then there's Sacrifice, which deals massive damage to all enemies at the cost of his own life. And considering Lars is the only one who knows the Revive spell, it never felt exactly worth it. The tree Yggdrasil is introduced here along with its reviving leaves, but only one can be carried at a time, making it more of an emergency use than a strategy. Meanwhile, Alyssa learns Chance, which causes a random effect to either your party or the monsters. It never seemed worth it at the expense of doing damage or using specific buffs and debuffs. The party itself gets the job done, but Lars and Alyssa often feel too weak for their own good, and managing their MP becomes a key part of the game when trying to reach the next destination. It doesn't help that each of them start at level 1 when joining the party, meaning a whole new round of grinding is necessary just to have them be equivalent to the hero. Now, Alyssa did become as strong as the other two at a lower level, so it's balanced in some way, but the process can feel like extra unnecessary work. In the same way, while many of the quests are handled in a similar manner to the original, they overall feel more obtuse this time around. Players often have to intonate what to do rather than a clear message from the NPCs. They'll lead you in the right direction, but actually solving them requires a bit more effort. Or, more accurately, finding them. Whereas Dragon Quest I featured a single continent, 2 contains 3 of them, plus multiple smaller islands. It is both one of the best new additions and most headache-inducing of the game. There was a wonderful sense of freedom once I obtained the boat and opened up the entire map. Up to this point, the game had been mostly linear. I had done some things out of order, making it harder on myself by pure accident, but there were generally only so many places I could go on land. With the boat, I could do anything in just about any order. The problem was, once again, finding it because there is no in-game map. The Japanese and English manuals did provide a general map to show the layout of the continents, but they only revealed the location of the 5 major kingdoms. It's meant to promote exploration, but it can be very easy to lose sense of where you are on an endless ocean. And there are some tiny islands that are vital to progress. I used an even better map online and still found myself slightly lost at times. However, players aren't completely cut free once they have the boat. After all, there's a piece of land directly across from where you head out to sea. And best of all, it turns out that this is Alefgard from Dragon Quest I. Same shape, same layout, though a bit smaller in scope with far less towns. While it is unfortunate that I couldn't visit everything that was in the first game, the revisit is all kinds of awesome. Seeing how Tantagel Castle has changed over the years is pretty neat and makes for a solid home base from this point forward. It's centralized once again, making it easy to set out in different directions. But just like the original game, the Dragon Lord's castle Charlock looms just across the water, except this time, I can sail right to it. And it is a pretty meaty dungeon, though suitably less maze-like than the new dungeons. And waiting at the very bottom is the Dragon Lord's grandson. Yeah, it turns out he somehow had a kid. Not only that, but he wants your help in defeating Hargon so he could make his own play at conquering the world. This supposed goal is never shown beyond the dialogue, but he is the one to lay out the goal of the remaining game. 5 crests must be found around the world in order to obtain a charm that will dispel the illusion that makes Hargon's castle in Rhone impossible to enter, and that's where the open world truly takes off. There is no set route to explore from this point. It's all about finding towns, dungeons, and shrines that point you toward the next crest or item necessary to reach that crest. There's a sense of freedom and adventure that really makes it shine, but here's where the lack of a map becomes a problem. I could find certain things, like a lighthouse to the south of Alefgard that actually contains one of the crests. It's a dungeon, but it's simple. But sometimes I would land on a continent and find that it's just a series of dead ends. Ultimately, in order to save on time and frustration, I consulted a more detailed fan map that listed every major location. Figuring out things from the towns would still be up to me. And sometimes it wouldn't be so bad. I find the town of Ostfair on an island where the king says he'll give me the moon crest if I defeat a caged monster he'll unleash in a gladiatorial battle. So I beat the monster with little issue and move on. But then there are moments that are much more esoteric. In order to reach Hargon's castle in Rhone, you have to enter a cave, but that cave won't appear without the Eye of Malroth. Where's that? You need to find it in a sea cave, but the water is too low for the ship to enter. It turns out we need a moon fragment, but to get that, the party needs to travel to the moon tower, which is located near Toon. However, in order to reach Toon, a maze-like river system needs to be navigated, along with a section of land that's not immediately obvious that you need to travel on. This circles you back to Toon, where if you pay attention to a dog, you'll discover that it has a water gate north of the main town portion that will raise the water level of the river and make it possible to reach the moon tower. However, it's locked and you need the water gate key. Where's that? Well, it turns out there's a thief known as Rogue Fastfinger, and only rumors of where he could be. The best is from a guard in the town of Welgarth who claims to have captured him, though his cell is now empty. But in order to inspect that cell, you need the jailer's key, which is found in Welgarth, but sold as a mystery item that is listed as a blank space in the shopkeeper's list. Oh, and it's 2,000 gold, which is a pretty significant amount of money if you've been upgrading your equipment consistently. With the jailer's key in hand, you can enter the cell and find a rogue if you explore to the right side where there's a hidden alcove. Talk to him, get the key, return to Toon, which doesn't have a save point, so you're traveling the river again, use the water gate key, raise the water, take on the moon tower dungeon so you can get the moon fragment, travel to the sea cave filled with lava, use the fragment to raise the water, and congratulations, you get to explore a hellacious maze-like dungeon to find the Eye of Malroth. It's a lot, and that's without mentioning the constant stream of random battles. It's easy to get bogged down by it all because the encounter rate feels so much worse this time around. There are moments where I could walk a sizable distance without getting attacked, but it seems like my repel magic was barely doing its job at certain points. Enemies were just too tough and would hit hard. I needed the experience, but battles would drain my resources fast. Just reaching Toon took several attempts because I just got attacked too much. So I had to use return to save and heal before trying again. It felt mind-numbing to make the same trek again and again in the hopes that one would stick. Sure, I could grind some more, but that just meant more battles. Better to actually try and reach my destination. The issue is compounded with the dungeons. They might not require torches anymore, but they are so much more complex with multiple paths leading to dead ends and sometimes a destination that's not immediately obvious. There are also times where important items are found off the beaten path, so if you don't use fan maps like I did, you will have to explore every nook and cranny to get a feel for how they work. Patience is the name of the game for Dragon Quest II, even with a guide, but by the end, I barely had any. The aforementioned Sea Cave stands out as one of the roughest dungeons, especially with how many powerful monsters are found within. I mean, here's the fan map I used. It shows exactly where everything goes, and it still feels confusing. But nothing matched the hell that was the Cave to Rhone. To even reach it, the player must travel to the western island of Baron and use a portal to reach an inaccessible portion of the main continent. After following the path through the poisonous swamps, there's nothing. But this is an area an NPC tells you about, as this is where the Eye of Malroth is used, revealing the Cave to Rhone. Of course, another villager also tells you that one of the crests necessary to even find Hargon's castle on Rhone is here. Now, the layout of the first floor and the abundance of floor traps leading to the floor below make it highly likely that players will stumble on the crest. From there, you have to backtrack to the Eastern Sea and find a small island where the Charm of Rubus will be given in exchange for the 5 crests. With this, you'll likely have everything you need to reach Rhone. Whether you actually reach it or not is another question entirely. Even after obtaining the best equipment in the game for my entire party, even using a duplication glitch so that both Lars and Alyssa can have the same armor, the Cave to Rhone is relentless. Not only is it a marathon of a dungeon with multiple paths and dead ends, not only are there loads of pits that take you back to the previous floor, but the monsters are some of the hardest in the game. Individually, they're not so bad. It's just with the frequent encounter rate and the combinations they can appear in, it becomes a marathon. And if 4 green dragons show up, you might as well attempt to run. Sometimes running away works, but it's unreliable. So I keep throwing myself at this cave, dying over and over again, noticing that enemies keep targeting the party member holding the Yggdrasil leaf, until finally I reach the other side, where even stronger monsters await and I have to hope to survive the trek to the final save and restore point. Somehow I managed it, but it leads to the question, how in the world did this happen? Simply put, the team never fully playtested the game until development was finished. Despite its tight deadline, the programming for Dragon Quest II was done by early November. It was ready for release right on schedule, but when the team finally sat down to play the entire game, they realized it was far too difficult. Essentially, as Yuji Horii put it in a 1987 interview, the balance between the character's strengths and the monster's strength wasn't right, but it was too late to haphazardly modify all the values. Instead, Koichi Nakamura created a fight simulation program so that the team could go through each monster and adjust the player level data and monster data individually. Unfortunately, that method still didn't work. After all, the team still wanted to make each individual fight tense and challenging, but because of the consecutive fights from random battles, it was still too hard. Compounding the issue was the fact that there were multiple monsters in each fight, and they compensated for one at a time. At this point, Dragon Quest II was impossible to play, as even meeting the Prince of Cannock was far too difficult. There simply wasn't enough time to fix a problem this ingrained in the game, and so it had to be delayed for a month while it was properly balanced. Because it would take far more than changing the stats of the player and enemies, the team looked at the layout of their initial map, at least until the entire party was formed. To help the hero reach the Prince of Cannock, they limited the number of monsters he could face at a time to 3, which improved the situation, but not enough. After all, the hero was a fighter that couldn't learn healing spells, which meant the farther he had to travel, the more difficult it would become. And so, Cannock Castle was moved closer to Middenhall, swapping its location with the Lake Cave where the first key could be found. Evidence of this can even be seen on the back of Dragon Quest II's Japanese box. This one change meant they had to rearrange the distribution of monsters and move the location of certain items in order to retain the game's balance. This would then be further tweaked by adjusting the monster and player stats as well as the price and strength of equipment. But the only way to know for sure if everything felt right was playtesting. And so the entire staff played the game over and over with their feedback all being conveyed to Hori. He'd then adjust the data, send the data to Nakamura to swap it into the game, and create a new prototype, then distribute those to playtesters to begin their process again. By the end of the month, new versions were coming out daily. So believe it or not, this is the easier version of the game. Hori admitted that the difficulty balance was only about 90% of the way there. He knew they could hit perfection eventually, but he didn't want the children eagerly anticipating it to wait any longer. It didn't help that the stress caused Hori to collapse from a stomach ulcer. This story puts the difficulty into perspective because without the extra time and obvious crunch, Dragon Quest II would be nigh unplayable. As it is, the game may be hard, but it is beatable. Rhone is where the kid gloves come off though. There might have been difficult monsters in the past, but you need to grind here before taking on Hargon's castle. The monsters are out in droves and come with the most powerful spells in the game: Defeat and Sacrifice. I may not use them myself because of their unreliability, but it is devastating when multiple enemies cast Defeat and catch one or more of your party, killing them instantly. It's even worse when they use Sacrifice, killing themselves, but ensuring that your entire party dies too. And the only solution was to get stronger so I could take them out even faster. Thankfully, there is a save point that also fully heals the party, making it the ideal spot to grind. Unfortunately, while I found the grind in the original Dragon Quest somewhat cathartic and easy to relax to, that never fully gelled in the sequel. I had to pay too much attention as something could go wrong at any moment. It was more engaging to be sure, but it also felt so long, and this final grinding session was not a short one. To put things into perspective, I arrived in Rhone with my hero at level 26. I wasn't able to make the final trek to Hargon's castle until I reached level 34, and even then I ran from almost every encounter to preserve MP as much as possible. That said, the castle is fascinating as when you arrive, it looks exactly like Meadenhall. You can talk to everyone, rest, and even buy items. But this is the illusion. When the charm of Rubus is used, the illusion dissipates, showing that you didn't actually rest or even buy new items. The castle itself isn't too bad to navigate outside a particular spot to use the Eye of Malroth to reach the next floor. No, what makes it tricky are the 3 boss monsters that must be fought before reaching Hargon. Thankfully, they're only moderately more powerful than standard enemies, but that still makes them a handful, especially when some of them know defeat. The thing is though, once I did start beating them, I felt locked in to finish the fight. Because if the game is saved and restarted, they will respawn. But if you escape the castle to heal and recover for a fresh run, then you don't have to fight them again. It takes a bit, but it allows you to go all out. Unfortunately for me, level 34 still wasn't good enough. Defeating Hargon is all about laying on as much damage as possible as quickly as possible, and unfortunately only the hero is going to be able to deal any real damage. The others will be necessary for buffs, debuffs, and healing. It wouldn't be so bad except Hargon can put the party to sleep and cast full heal on himself to extend the fight even longer. I eventually got him on my first attempt, but my resources were spent and I was in trouble. Like the Dragon Lord before him, Hargon's not the end. But rather than a second form, he summons a being of pure malice known as Malroth. Thankfully, there's time to heal the party before Malroth attacks, and while Malroth certainly hits harder than Hargon, he has less tricks. But that matters little when one of them is the full heal spell. Add in the fact that he's harder to hit accurately, and my first attempt ended in failure. I needed to grind more. Thankfully, at level 38, which became 39 over the course of the attempt, I had a much better handle on Malroth. I brought down the monster and saved the world from Hargon's dark designs. And, just like the original game, it's possible to revisit towns in a monster-free overworld to get congratulated on a job well done before arriving back in Meadenhall. And once there, your father proclaims you as the new king and recognizes the 3 of you as descendants of Erdrick and heroes of the realm. It's a rather standard ending, but no less satisfying after working so hard to get there. Dragon Quest II is absolutely an ambitious game, and the fact that so much was improved upon in less than a year is incredible. I didn't even mention it, but this was the first game to include a casino. Kinda. It's just a simple game of slots to earn extra items, but it's there. Not everything made it in though, as Hori revealed in the same 1987 article about the difficulty that there were cut features as well due to the memory limitations. One of the earliest casualties were cutscenes that would play during specific scenes, much like a single comic panel. In memory of the idea, the team actually included one of the planned scenes in the instruction manual. The sunken treasure quest that's found within the game was also initially longer, but it had to be shortened due to the ideas being too grand. There were even alternate endings that Hori had in mind. One involved various characters coming to Meadenhall to pay respects to the hero as the new king before a dance took place. The other was far more depressing, as the Prince of Cannock would sacrifice himself to defeat Malroth. The party would mourn his loss as people congratulate you on saving the world, until a young girl would appear, the prince's sister, proclaiming that the hero killed her brother before stabbing him in the chest. The hero would die as the shocked court looked on. That was obviously far too dark, and so it was scrapped in favor of the simpler one in the game. Still, it would have been incredibly bold. Other items had to be cut as well, which explains the empty chests throughout the world, though Hori did explain one of them. The dangerous swimsuit would be as effective as the main code item, but incredibly expensive. However, if it was bought and equipped to the princess, her sprite would change to show her wearing it. Maybe a tad too risque for the Famicom, though it did make it into the MSX port of the game. Of course, that didn't stop the return of the Puff Puff scene. This time it appears in Leonport, where the ship is obtained. The bunny girl offers the Puff Puff for 100 gold and even accuses the princes of being gay if they refuse. But, like the original, it was cut from the Western release entirely, even excising the bunny girl. There were other changes as well to fit with the standards of Nintendo of America, as they often forbade religious imagery. So any sign that the new churches that revived party members and cured poison were churches was removed. Fallen party members were also shown with a ghostly outline in the West compared to a casket in Japan. However, the West did get two things Japan didn't, at least initially. The first would be a battery save, as the Japanese version relied on passwords for save data. The other was the opening sequence that featured the attack on Moonbrook. In the Japanese version, it begins with the soldier arriving at Meadenhall to tell of Hargon's attack. However, all future Japanese versions would include this scene. Sales of Dragon Quest II in Japan dwarfed the original. Whereas the first game sold 1 million copies in its first 6 months, the sequel sold 2.4 million copies in its first year, nearly doubling Dragon Quest I's total sales. And this is just the Famicom version, as, like the original, Dragon Quest II has been ported a lot. In 1988, there were MSX and MSX2 versions, though they're generally seen as inferior. Then in 1993, Dragon Quest I and II were bundled for the first time and released on the Super Famicom, both being based on Dragon Quest V's engine. These included a modern targeting system and stat-increasing items that could be found throughout the world. The next would be in 1999 for the Game Boy Color, and while the graphics were 8-bit, the game was based on the Super Famicom version with better difficulty balancing. Even better, this version actually got released in the West. Finally, it was released individually for mobile phones in 2014 and released worldwide with an updated translation, which is where the new monster names and new subtitle first debuted. Dragon Quest II would officially be called Luminaries of the Legendary Line. This is the version that would later be ported to the Switch. And like Dragon Quest I, any of these available versions are better than the original, though with the added bonus of being far less punishing than before. The Switch might be the easiest to obtain on console, but these early Dragon Quest games really do benefit from being on the phone. Grinding for a bit while waiting for doctor's appointments or anything of the sort makes it feel like progress is being made rather than a slog. I should also mention the spin-off Dragon Quest Builders 2, an excellent game in its own right that picks up sometime after Dragon Quest II. In it, the followers of Hargon are trying to take revenge for their master's defeat by preventing creation of any kind by eliminating builders. But the player finds himself making friends with a strange boy named Malroth, who finds himself compelled to help them improve their building skills. Trust me, it's a fantastic follow-up that greatly improves upon the original builders. But playing Dragon Quest II after all this time was a roller coaster of a playthrough. What began as an absolute joy with each improvement I encountered slowly devolved into a grind to just reach the end. A guide was simply too necessary to keep things moving without having to slowly check every nook and cranny myself, and the difficulty over time was relentless. I can understand its popularity at the time and how it pushed the genre forward on consoles, but I also know why its reputation has soured over time. While the original may be simpler, it's a cozier experience for me, and I know the series only gets better from here. It's not a necessary game to play, but it's worth knowing its importance, because without it, the sequel wouldn't be as beloved as it is. Lessons were learned, and 1988 would see the series grow from popular to a national phenomenon. But will the NES version still hold up today? That's what I'll find out in the next leg of this journey as I play Dragon Quest III for the first time. Look forward to that in the future. But in the meantime, tell me your memories of Dragon Quest II. Have you ever played it before, and what version if so? Do you like it better than the original? Thanks for watching, and as always, please consider subscribing to Good Vibes Gaming, hitting the like button, and ringing that bell. We also have a Patreon at patreon.com/dvgaming with plenty of extra perks. Until next time, bye!